So Don, this is a special one. It's a very special. In fact, we're gonna have to do it in two parts. We're talking about the big punches and when all of a sudden they got the nicknames. When all of a sudden in our sport of boxing, that's what people went to watch, went to see. They got excited about it. How far back would you be able to start us from talking about the big hitters, talking about the ones that really stood out?
Right. Well, in the history of boxing, the big hitter and big attraction probably goes hand in hand, John. It's just the excitement. The guy who kicks the most goals in football, the guy who kicks the most home runs in baseball are always going to attract more attention. You go back to the early days in the bare knuckle days and you transition into the barge era where they're going to Queensberry rules. They didn't have mass crowds because it was basically illegal. So it's not a mass spectator sport. But even then, like a John L. Sullivan was known as a powerful, strong man, and he attracted attention. And then early, I guess, Bob Fitzsimmons was a guy that people always recognize, one of the hardest hitters. He was 168 pounds. He was really a light heavyweight, but he was such a great puncher, was able to fight heavyweights, weighing light heavyweights. So they sometimes erroneously list him among, he was heavyweight champ, but as a heavyweight champ, he was truly a light heavyweight, 168, 170, but with the power. But as boxing was quasi-legal in Britain and quasi-legal in the States, by the 1920s, it became a mass spectator sport, creation of the New York Athletic Commission, the NBA, the British Boxing Board of Control. And now you are not attracting crowds just to a small club with 1,000 or 2,000 people. Now you want to attract 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people and 100,000. And the guy who really was behind that was Jack Dempsey. I think he was the first great popular figure. I mean, Stanley Ketchel in the middleweight division, Bob Fitzsimmons, they were notable punchers at the turn of the century. Terry McGovern, great knockout punches, but it didn't translate into this mass spectator sport where you knew you were a promoter, you had a great puncher, you had a great attraction.
And amazingly, it's like catch-22. Some promoters, they'll pay you per round. They want you to last as long as possible, but they also want the razzmatazz of the big punches. We have punches from the small divisions, but as you said, you mentioned Jack Dempsey there. It was people, the heavyweights, the bigger the guys, the bigger the shot, the bigger the knockout, the more sensational the knockout. Who was the one that, in your opinion, really stood out from the turn of the century?
Well, going pre-Dempsey we're talking or up after the turn of the century. I mean, the guys who were the great punchers and most notable at that, and you had Fitzsimmons, you had Stanley Ketchel, was a great knockout puncher. Terry McGovern was a bantamweight and a featherweight champ. And they were so unique that they became famous. 50 years later, Nat Fleischer was rating these guys number 1, number 2 in the division because the impact of that knockout punch was so impressive to individuals. They weren't going rounds, they were knocking guys out. And you could see as promoters and managers and the fans paid attention, these were the kind of styles that were going to translate into the attractions that people wanted to see later.
Did they appreciate the boxing skill finished by the knockout, or did you appreciate that raw style of crash bang wallop? But they just had nothing about them, but you knew if they hit you, if they touched you, you were gone.
Yeah, I think fans always say even today, oh, I like the art of boxing. But I think the general person, if you don't know boxing, say, what's this all about? Well, the guy who's laying down counted out, he's the loser. And the guy standing up, he's the winner. You rarely get a controversial decision with a knockout. I always say, if you don't want to have a bad decision, knock the guy out. So that's like ending a fight with an exclamation point rather than a period or a question mark. They know the winner. So it's easier to follow. I know who won that fight. He's the guy who stood over the other guy and they counted 10. So it made it simple for the fans, and that explosiveness, people looked after it. Another fighter bring back from the early days, who's one of the few, there's only been 15 fights in the history, and we talk about BoxRec, they would list 700,000 fighters. There's only been 10 or 12, in fact, who scored 100 or more knockouts. And one of the earliest guys to do it was Sam Langford, a great non-world.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, I forgot about 5 different division and was a phenomenal fighter. Just you came in and people said you knew your goose was cooked when the bell rang. You saw him in the opposite corner. He scored over 100 knockouts. One of the first boxers ever to do that.
Let's bring it closer to an age where maybe a lot of the viewers will probably say, "I've heard of that name. I know who that is." The likes of Joe Louis. Joe Louis. He had skill. He had class. He had that finish. And again, was it that was the attraction? You saw the boxing skill as well as that knockout power. But then you'd look at the raw brutality, and you look at people like Rocky Marciano. It wasn't a tickling contest there. The people like Sonny Liston, they just walk you down. They stalked you, and then you knew that the kind of knockouts these guys created, people were literally unconscious.
Oh, tremendous! You know, you mentioned Joe Louis. I mean, Joe Louis, in defense of his heavyweight title, scored 5 one-round knockouts, unprecedented. He scored 3 consecutive one-round knockouts, a record that will probably never be broken, in defense of his heavyweight title. One of the most memorable fights of all time was his one-round KO with Max Schmeling. It was so spectacular. Without the political overtones, no one asked for their money back. They said, oh, I only saw 1 round. It was one of the most exciting moments in sport. When he came to New York and as a non-champion, he fought Primo Carnera, who himself had like 60 knockouts, 50,000 people. But the fight that really made him, he knocked out Max Baer. And this was a confrontation of the 2 greatest punchers of their generation. Baer lost the title on a close decision, but he had killed a man, Ernie Scharf, in the ring, had been the result of him dying in a subsequent fight with Carnera. But the beating was affected by Baer, and who had killed another man. So he had that kind of power, that kind of truly frightening, murderous power. And he faces Joe Louis, this guy who's coming in with 80% knockout ratio, and drew $1 million gate for 2 non-champions. It was phenomenal, 80,000 people. So it's sure these knockout punches, when they confronted each other, there was nothing bigger in boxing. And just Joe Louis, he had boxing skills, but also the power to knock you out with a left hand, a right hand, and a combination. Phenomenal.
And you know a true boxer that can knock you out, not just by hitting you on the chin, by taking you out to the body. And you're trying to figure out which one's more lethal, the headshot or the body shot. The body shot, you're still conscious. You can't breathe. You can't stand up. You can't defend yourself. The knockout's in. Most people can get knocked out if you get hit in the right sweet spot. But the real punches, the true brutes, are the ones that would take you out to the body. That would terrorize you the second they got in the ring. And we move further on to the likes of, I don't know, Sonny Liston, another heavy-handed big hitter.
Yeah, he was a guy. I mean, he had such a reputation coming in as a contender, probably as great as anybody since Joe Louis, before he was champ. And that's probably where his greatness lied. But you got in the ring with him, and he could just bowl you over. And he had that power, the great jab, could knock you out with a jab, as they say in the business. But and fought great battles with Cleveland Williams, another knockout puncher, and just prevailed over him, and then knocked out Wayne Bethea in 1 round, destroyed a big Nino Valdez. He was an intimidating puncher who really could destroy you with any body shots to the head, jabs, hooks. He just had the perfect combination of everything, lethal.
Maybe the worst kind of punches are the ones that aren't champions because they're avoided by everybody and anybody. They're in the who needs him club. I'm sure, apart from the likes of Williams and Shavers, these guys were just guys you just didn't want to give it a chance because they were just too dangerous.
Yeah, well, we mentioned Sam Langford. He never got a title fight. He had 300 fights. He beat 10 Hall of Famers. And he had that saying, as you brought up, about punching to the body, kill the body and the head will die. And I mean, he got a lot of fights. He just didn't get fights with the guys like Tommy Burns, who were world champion. Jack Johnson wouldn't give him a rematch after they fought. That fight, actually, Johnson dominated him in an early fight, but he also outweighed Langford by 40 pounds. So you would assume he would dominate him. But yes, there are a lot of this. Curtis Shepard was another lethal puncher that wasn't able to get a world title fight. You just avoided them. Ruben Hurricane Carter fought for the title, but a bit past his peak. Tiger Jack Fox got 1 shot at the title. He was in a stabbing a few weeks before, wasn't up to his best. When he lost, they never gave him another opportunity, and he had scored over 100 knockouts. So yes, the thing is, you never fight a puncher unless you have to, and so some of these guys were kicked to the wayside, even though we were deserving of championship fights, but never got the opportunity.
I remember former light heavyweight champion Bob Foster. This guy could bang, and he fancied his stint in the heavyweight division. But this guy was dangerous. He was one of those fighters that looked like he had nothing about him, but when he touched you, he was dangerous.
A tall string being kind of a guy, like an Alexis Arguello, for people who might remember him more than Foster. I remember the night Foster won the light heavyweight title. I was there in Madison Square Garden, and he boxed the fighter Dick Tiger, who had never been counted out before. He was a middleweight champ, then light heavyweight champ, and Foster hit him with a shot, left hook, right hand. Tiger went down. You could see the photographs. He's frozen on the ring, frozen. I thought he had killed him. I'm not that familiar with boxing, but as if somebody shot him dead, and he finally got up, but he was out. Foster could lay you out with one shot. Ironically, fought Joe Frazier, and he got hit with a left hook from Frazier, another formidable puncher, and he was knocked out the way that Tiger was. So these are two great punchers. But Foster, I think, the greatest puncher of all time, even though Archie Moore scored knockouts, more knockouts than Foster. Foster's knockout percentage was far higher, and that's what he does. He could hit you and kill you with that right hand or left hook. The best left hook I've ever seen.
Before we touch on Archie Moore, it's a 50-50. You get some big punchers that can punch, but are also as vulnerable. They could hit Tommy Hearns, big puncher, but he was vulnerable.
Yes.
But then you got some big hitters, probably less than the guys that were vulnerable to the chin that could hit, but you could never get rid of. George Foreman, big beast of a man. He could knock people out, but he had a head of granite.
Yeah. Yes. Well, he had size to his advantage. So he's a big man and a big puncher, where the guys like Marciano, Frazier had to get into you in order to do damage. And as you say, it's odd with the physiognomy of a guy like Foster. Alexis Arguello, Sandy Sadler. These guys were tall. Tommy Hearns, perfect example. Tall, rangy guys. They had incredible power. We don't know where it came from. We had a baseball player here in America, Ted Williams, one of the greatest hitters of all time. Tremendous home run hitter. That's a long ball hitter. And he was a tall, skinny guy, but he just had a natural power. Unfortunately, with fighters like that, they can kill you. But as you say, John, they are also susceptible for somebody like a Hagler to come in and knock out a Hearns, or a Frazier to come in and knock out a Foster. And then they can be hit. So they trade one for the other. The power, for whatever reason, their physical makeup, for the vulnerability that if they get hit, sometimes they fall apart. But Foreman uniquely was a big man. He had the reach and height advantage. So for a small man to get in, like when Frazier tried to, he could just stop him with those blows as he walked in, like Sonny Liston with a Floyd Patterson. So you could be a good puncher like Patterson was, but you'd have to get inside. And these guys had the height and reach and the bulk, I guess, what the other guys didn't have to offset that.
Archie Moore, Brendan, my old coach and mentor, he was a big fan of Archie Moore's. He had a style that was it wasn't obvious, but his style, his power was sneaky, it was crafty, but it was powerful and skillful at the same time. Again, an underrated banger in Archie Moore.
Yeah. I mean, he had 132 knockouts in his career. It's ironic. There's a fighter who scored the most stoppages. I won't call them cold knockouts. He's a British fighter, Billy Bird. No one talks about him. He actually had more knockouts than Moore, not against the kind of opposition that Archie Moore fought, but he would stop guys on cuts. So that's not to be confused with the guy who's a definite puncher. But Archie could knock you out. I mean, there's the famous fight with Yvonne Durrell, where he was dropped, I don't know, half a dozen times. Yet he had so much power in his hand, he could come back from this and knocked out Durrell. So it's with that kind of punch, they tell you as a fighter, it's the last thing that goes. But not only the last thing that goes in career, but probably the last thing that goes in a fight, where you see guys with this power can come from behind, figured by everybody watching the fight they're done, that because you have power, you can equalize it. And Moore had that kind of power where it could just hit you and boom, you'd go. Late in the fight, early in the fight, whenever.
Films are made about various fighters, and obviously one I've got to touch on is Hurricane Carter.
Oh, yes.
Big puncher, came out of the nick. Middleweight, if I remember, would it be middleweight, light middleweight? But he could punch. He'd walk a man down and basically destroy him.
Yeah, well, his most famous knockout, Emil Griffith, Emil Griffith had close to 100 fights, was stopped twice in his career, once towards the end by Monzon, and very late in the fight, and he was on his feet when the referee intervened. And then that time with Carter, just ran across the ring, hit him on the chin, and boom, it was over. So you knew he had explosive power. He waited a while to get his title fight. It was a very close decision loss to Joey Girardello. But if Carter hit you, you were gone. He just had the ability to do that. And yes, tremendous knockout punch, and intimidating with the bald head. He sort of played it up as well. So, what is this guy? He predated Marvin Hagler with that kind of looking like a bullet head, I guess. And he was a bullet, looking for you. But they're tremendous puncher.
Well, that was going to be my next question. The ones that were very like the more modern day fighters that from yesteryear. I always compared the likes of Sonny Liston to a Mike Tyson.
Mm-hmm.
Sonny Liston was the original Mike Tyson. People were terrified of him, but he could punch at the same time. He could bully, and he actually could back up the post. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy on his day. Who would you compare to somebody like Hurricane Carter or someone like that? Who would you compare? How would you do that?
Well, in today's market, you got Gennady Golovkin, who's been a string of knockouts. I don't know if he was intimidating. Carter was unique. He was sort of like, again, a Sam Langford, a Joe Louis, those kind of guys. They would come into Sonny Liston's the best example. Tyson at his peak, they would come in the ring and they probably would have the fight won psychologically before the bell rang, because the reputation was such. You'd hear this, and this guy would go in there, you'd be lost. I heard many, many fighters talk about how Joe Louis, they were beaten before the bell rang. They knew they couldn't beat him. They tried to survive, but they felt in their heart they couldn't beat them. And as a boxer, psychologically, if you're coming in without the self-confidence to at least say you've got a chance, or at least you're going to be on even ground, no matter how the odds are, you're gone. And they would just, it was so frightening to see their records, to watch them, how they literally destroyed guys. That was the mystique. This is as powerful as their physical advantages.
We're talking about the intimidation style, but then when you came across the likes of people like Sugar Ray Robinson, that were well known for the skill, but also that knockout power, that must have been intimidating for many, many fighters to know they've got to get in there with somebody that's fast, that's all rounded, well rounded, can punch, can box, can move, can make you work when you least want to. Again, there was very few of them.
Yes. No, he was so great. I mean, there was a more modern fighter, more contemporary fighter, Jose Napoles. I knew him very well. And I remember him knocking out John Jocelyn, who was a European welterweight champ at one point, with a body shot. And he knocked out with an uppercut Ernie Red Lopez, who was a tough guy. And Robinson had that everything, the boxer, the puncher. We talked about him on prior broadcasts. But as Paul Pender fought him twice and went the limit and beat him, said Robinson wasn't just the greatest fighter, he was the greatest puncher of all time. And if you look at his record, he could score a 1-round knockout over you, could score a 15th round knockout over you. He just had the perfect package. But the range of punches, the hooks, the uppercuts, a beautiful left hook, he could hook off the jab and knock you out. Just tremendous. And again, that has to affect you going in with a fighter, and all you're hearing, this is the greatest fighter of all time. This is the greatest fighter that ever lived. This is the best pound for pound. Wow, what a thing for an opponent to have to deal with. Forgetting about the actual record of 100 knockouts plus. You're going in with this, that everybody in the world's telling you you're fighting the greatest fighter who ever lived. What chance do you really have in your mind? You have to really bite the bullet and just go in there and say, I'll take my shots.
There's one fighter that I saw live, and for me, when I saw him, I thought, this guy's devastatingly dangerous. I mean, to the point where he hit a man and turned to walk away before he even landed, before he even fell. And that's got to be Julian Jackson. Yes. Julian Jackson was, I have never seen anything like that in my life. This guy, how he could hit people and know the second the punch lands.
Yep. Well, a famous fight, and I remember being at that one, was Errol Graham and Jackson. Graham was boxing fairly well, and then he followed. He was 2 left hooks, boom, boom, like 2 cannons going off. And he hit him, and Jackson reminded me of that Dick Tiger fight. If you recall, Graham was laid out. I mean, he was out cold. And Errol Graham is a guy you don't know. He's sort of similar to yourself, on a lesser version of yourself. A beautiful boxer, tall. You couldn't hit him. He moved around the ring. But boy, that night he got hit. And as I said, you could have counted to 100, as the old saying goes. And Jackson, formidable also, John Mugabe, another great puncher.
Yeah, John Mugabe. I was at that Julian Jackson fight. And I will tell you now, we saw Julian Jackson, because the fight had to take place in Marbella, if I remember right.
Yes, in Spain.
And because Julian didn't pass the medical over here in the UK because his eyesight was that bad. We saw him running in the streets, going on a jog the fight week. He had minders either side of them, not because they were minding him, not because they were showing him which way to go, because his eyesight was that bad. So we joked and said, this guy's like Mr. Magoo. He had thick glasses and he couldn't see anything. And so it came to the fight itself. And I was very close to ringside. I could hear Brendan shouting, telling Errol what to do and saying, look, you've got this guy. The referee came to court and said, look, I'm giving him one more round and he's out. Errol was absolutely peppering. But I do remember that right before Errol got knocked out, Julian Jackson threw a shot and it didn't fully land. It just whisked the lips of Graham. And when he came back to the corner, Brendan went to take the gum shield out and Julian Jackson had snapped the teeth in two.
Wow.
So, and so Brennan, whoa, put the teeth back in. Errol didn't know because
Yeah.
obviously the adrenaline's there and everything. This guy could punch. When a man can punch you and break your teeth.
Yes.
And so Brendan just put it back in again, gave him some water and said, just keep him on the jab. The fight's won. Errol, you know, was always classed as a fancy Dan, even though he had a good knockout ratio on his record. And Errol went out there, and you could see him thinking, "Shall I go for glory and knock out this big puncher that everybody's saying is a dangerous puncher?" But he made the same mistake as every opponent. Errol and I used to live together, so and I used to watch the videos of Julian Jackson. And what would happen is Julian Jackson, he couldn't see. And as soon as you came inside, he'd let the shot go. The only guy that had beaten him to that point was Mike McLaren. Mike McLaren was smart. He blocked with the forearms, walking down, and then let the shots hit the forearm. And then he beat. That's how he beat him. Errol refused to do it. He said, "Look, I know exactly how to do this guy." The shot itself, you could see Julian's shots getting closer. Then boom, Julian knew the second he landed, the fight was done. But then I've seen him before when he's hit a guy, put his hand up and just turned around and walked away. And the guy's not even started falling yet. So to me, when I saw something like that, there was nothing about him. Physically, his body, he wasn't a big, muscle-bound fighter. He just, some guys have just got that timing, that speed, that accuracy that gives them that sort of power. And John the Beast McGarvey, his style was raw, he was rugged, but it was in your face.
No, that was it, you know, and Julian a little bit different in that situation. Mugabe more of the slugger. But as we said earlier, sometimes it's not, you would think the most muscle-bound and powerful guy is going to be a powerful puncher. No, it's something to do with either the snap in the wrist or your arms or how your muscles are developed. But there's Bob Foster, Arguello, Sadler, and Jackson. You see him walking down the street with thick glasses. You would say, "Sir, can I help you across the street?" Not thinking he could hit you with one shot in 3 inches and just destroy you. It's another thing. These short punches, where these natural punches they're so powerful, it can travel 6 inches and knock you cold. And you say, "No, he's got to load up and throw that from a foot away." No, they can just snap their hands and bang, you're out of there. It's remarkable. I don't know, you know, physics that well to describe it, but there's something inherent that they have in you. You can just drop the shot on you. And
I remember when Prince Asim Hamid boxed Kevin Kelly. And Kevin Kelly, before they fought, came to one of Naz's fights. And he said at ringside, "I'm going to smoke your boots." And Naz didn't quite understand what that meant. It wasn't till after the fight, which was an amazing fight out there in New York, where he handboxed on the undercard.
Remember that one as well, 6 knockdowns.
And Naz said, then he brought it up afterwards in the hotel. He said, "Johnny, now I know what he meant by smoking your boots." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Because he hit me and my feet were on fire." My feet were on fire. And I just saw, and I was thinking in the fight, Jesus, that's what he means. Naz had an unbelievable bottle. But you know, when a guy knows he can hit you, he has the speed and the time and the accuracy to get it in, like your Kevin Kelly's. He knows what he's doing. But to hear that phrase, "I'm going to smoke your boots," Naz says, "Johnny, it's the first time in my life that is it, and the first and last in his life that he had ever been hit where someone's feet were on fire."
Wow.
And I just don't know. It's an unbelievable gift to have to be able to create such power.
Yes, I've heard guys get hit with the body. I was telling you about that fight with the rematch with Ernie Red Lopez and Jose Napoles. And that was sort of very short uppercut, and the guy just went down. I remember the fight with Bernard Hopkins, if you do, and Oscar De La Hoya. And he hit him that shot in the body, and they'll say they're just paralyzed. They can't move. You know, it just gets a solar plexus. That's what Fitzsimmons was famous for in his fight with Corbett. But yeah, they just know how to do it. I don't know. It's like you read about karate or jujitsu where they can hit you a certain part of the body or just get in there, and there's a pressure point that you can do. And I think great knockout punchers have that instinct to do it, whether they search it out, but they just do it. Yeah.
Who do you think is the better knockout artist between, and we're not looking at records, we're not looking at who's done more fights and lost more fights. Who do you think is the better knockout artist between Canelo Alvarez and Triple G?
Wow. You know, Canelo is probably the better all-rounded fighter. But I guess, you know, if you the uninitiated, you're going to say Golovkin. I would say the better fighter that sets you up with pure power, I got to go with Golovkin. the better fighter can set you up for a knockout, which is a little bit different. You know, if you go to pure power and you say, well, who was a greater puncher, Sugar Ray Robinson or Reuben Carter? Probably Carter. But Robinson knew how to set you up for the knockout. You know, he wasn't just on physical strength. So, you know, to me, I like Golovkin as the better puncher, but the more well-rounded fighter who could set you up for the knockout, I would say Canelo. But just going pure puncher like Golovkin, like an Ernie Shavers, although they're better punchers than him.
I've seen Golovkin knock guys out on the top of the head. As long as he can hit you, he doesn't. And to me, it's like it's madness. I can remember seeing Nigel Benn against Gerald Mclaren. Now, Gerald Mclaren is that powerful. I think it was the first or the second round he hit Nigel Benn. He knocked him out of the ring. He slid him out of the ring. And I mean, he didn't like stagger out of the ring. He literally punched him out of the ring. And you knew this guy knew he had that punch power. This guy was a known in boxing world as a known assassin before that fight. Because again, he was one of the very few that could get that. I suppose it's like a golf swing. I suppose it's like hitting a with a racket in tennis. You've just got to get the right timing. He had that. John McClellan had that raw power. Even though Nigel Benn maybe had that knockout aggressive style, Gerald had that frightening knockout power.
Yes, one of the highest knockout percentages. Again, he gets diminished because he lost that fight, but we know what kind of fight that was. That was just a brutal battle. And, you know, because I guess Nigel had more skills effectively than McClellan, and also sometimes you get lucky, just hit the guy in the chin. You've had fights where guys say, I've been winning all day, get hit, and that's an anomaly. But yeah, for pure power, there's a guy walking. I would match him with anybody, any fighter of any time, McClellan. You know, I think he's probably a harder hitter than Golovkin, as good as Golovkin is, but they just stood there in a small ring. I would bet McClellan almost against, you know, anybody.
The scariest kind of punches are the punches that believe they're unbeatable. And you know, you get some punches that can dish it out but can't take it back. Gerald McClellan was one of those fighters that believed he was unbeatable. Even when he boxed Nigel, you know, he wasn't giving up. But Nigel had that craziness about him where he thought, I don't care, unless I'm out, stretch it out, it's not going to happen. You know, Golovkin, he's got that style where he's going to walk you down. You'd look at the likes of Thomas Hearns. Thomas Hearns, even though he knew he was vulnerable, he still made that commitment to say, I'm coming in, I'm going to sharpshoot, I'm going to gamble. 9 times out of 10, I'm going to win this gamble. 9 times out of 10, he did.
Well, perfect example was the Hagler fight. You know, he did lose that, but he didn't back off. They didn't say, here's your strategy. You got the height, the weight, you got the height and reach over him, stay away. He just couldn't do it. The instinct of the puncher just took over and was a terrific, great fight, you know.
But he proved he could box as well, because when he backed Sugar Ray Leonard in the first fight, he was actually out. He was actually ahead on points until the stoppage against Sugar Ray. And I think his boxing ability was underrated because his highlight, his show reel, were the knockouts. The knockouts, when you look at the likes of people like when he knocked out Duran and people like that, he'd set people up and he had it all going for him. So his boxing ability was underrated, but he could generate that power because he had those long levers, because he would make that commitment to set it up, because it's that split second of setting your feet, setting your hands, setting your target, setting the shot. And not many fighters have that kind of bottle to do that unless they can bully and bulldoze you like, I don't know, Mike Tyson.
Yeah, well, you say timing is everything in boxing. And that's, again, I don't know how instinctual it is. You know, they show the famous punches of all time, of course, there's Ray Robinson knocking out Gene Foreman. You have highlight reels, you see that. Guy had never been knocked out before, and he just threw a punch, boom, took about 2 seconds, walked in through the shot. You can see that bit with the Foster Tiger fight that I brought up earlier. And it happens, again, they're just natural punches. They just know when to let it go, and they know their range. That's another big important thing. You know, you've got to be right in the range where the full power gets behind it. And sometimes it's from inches, and sometimes it's from a long way out. But they can do it. And Tommy Hearns, Robinson, guys on that level, Joe Louis could do it. You know, there's a fight that he had with Tammy Moriello in his comeback after the war. He got rocked in that fight on the ropes. And you figure, oh, Louis is in trouble. But he got out of it, measured Moriello, and hits him one shot, and boom, he's out of there, you know. So that's something, being a great fighter, but as well as a great puncher. But knowing what their punching ability allows them to have, and knowing what allows them to punch like that, and where they're in the right place at the right time, and they just know how to do it.
And do you think punchers, the majority of punchers, neglect the technique because they know they can punch? Could you? I suppose I could put my finger on probably a half a dozen fighters that, even though because they knew they had that punch power, they neglected the other attributes you needed to be a stay on top champion.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, some of them, again, that's what they have. Some guys are great boxers, they're skilled, but don't have any power. Some guys have great power, but they don't have the skills. But I think they have a tendency not to develop. In baseball, we have pitchers. Now they changed the rule where they used to bat. Well, the pitcher notoriously is a terrible hitter. They just don't try to develop because they're there to throw the ball, not to hit the ball. And as you say, when a guy becomes a great puncher, they said you could develop as a boxer. I mean, Joe Frazier always wanted people to appreciate his jab. He wanted to appreciate his boxing ability. People said, look, just go knock guys out. So some of them don't. You have the exceptions. You have the Sugar Ray Robinsons who will do that. Archie Moore, skilled guy. But they have a tendency not to. The great fighters have it overall, but and they always want to be appreciated. Rocky Marciano and Roberto Duran's another one. Always talk about his boxing skills, which if you'd study him and you're a fighter, skill, styles, boxing, he does have exceptional skill, but the knockout power is so great that people overlook that. But when you watch boxing with Duran, he can outbox you if he had to just rely on that.
I think you're so right there. I can remember I used to train with a guy, use him as one of my chief sparring partners. Never got beyond British title level, but this guy could fight. He loved to fight. And he used to say to me, he finds fighting easier than boxing because he doesn't have to think about it. Mm-hmm. And when you'd look at the likes of Roberto Duran, you'd think this guy is he's just raw, he's crude, he just wants to fight. But I suppose there's a method to the madness in that style, because if you overall someone with your aggressive presence, your aggressive style, and you can punch as well, mm-hmm. you get them to dance your dance. You get them to you make it pretty even if you get a man to fight your kind of fight. Yeah. And the guy I'm talking about was a guy called John Buster Keaton. He was a British cruiserweight champion. And every time I use him as a sparring partner, I find sparring with him, even though I made a record of defenses, I found sparring with him harder than any fight I actually had, because and I knew him, so I knew what he could do, and I knew what to avoid, and knew how to manhandle him. But I also knew he was so dangerous because in his head, he's thinking, if I knock Johnny out, mm-hmm. I'll be able to step in and get the chance. So I knew when we sparred, it was like a fight. But then afterwards, he'd be exhausted because he'd commit himself physically, emotionally, mentally. He'd say to me, I couldn't fight how you fight. I went, why? He said, because I don't have to think about what I'm doing. You think about jabbing, moving, throwing the right hand. I'm like, Jesus. To me, that's pure madness. So when you talk about the likes of Roberto Duran, or we'll probably touch on it in series 2, Mike Tyson, Dante Wilder, people like that, these guys have got something about them where they find it easier. Mm-hmm. They find calm throughout chaos, being in your face, in the eye of the storm. Yeah. They find calm there, and they find the ability to pull it out of the bag. Mm-hmm. and pull the win there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, they have that in their arsenal, so it's like not using it. It's like, you're in a war, and a terrible analogy today, but you have a nuclear weapon, so we're losing this war. But I always know at the end of the day, I have that to pull out of my pocket. I have that loaded gun in my pocket if I need it. I would ask you, you were a great boxer. Is it harder to have a box? Every guy has to know rudimentary boxing skills. I don't know, you just close your eyes and go in slugging. You got to know how to jab, a hook. Can a boxer become a punch? Is it hard for a boxer to learn how to punch, or a puncher to learn how to box? Can you say you were a boxer? If you said, I want to increase my knockout ability, is there a way to do that? I want to increase my, my knockout.
I actually think as a boxer to learn how to be a banger, it's not. If you're a banger, you're a banger. You're a banger. Even if you can't box, you're a banger because your body, the way you put the shots together, how your body, the mechanics of your body move. It just happens without you even knowing how you do it. but
Right.
it just happens.
Right.
For a puncher to be a boxer, yes, that's more possible, but
Mhm.
he can only rely on that punch power to get him out of trouble when he wants to cut corners and be
Right.
a little lazy.
Right.
You get some fighters that are unbelievable technical geniuses, and you
Mhm.
think, oh my goodness, if you could knock people out, you
Yeah.
would be box office. You would be, and I'm quite sure, you'd look at these guys and they just think they had the boxing ability, but
Mhm.
then they didn't have that punch power, that finishing power. The
Mhm.
ones that really stood out, became superstars,
Yeah.
were the ones that had the both of them. They
Yes.
could box, they could knock him out. Prince Hasim Hamid was one of them.
Mhm.
Floyd Mayweather's one of them.
Yeah.
We could go to Sugar Ray Robinson's one of them,
Sugar
because
Ray Leonard.
Sugar Ray Leonard. Oh my goodness, Sugar Ray Leonard
Yeah.
is probably one of my favorites,
Mhm.
because their style was as a purist. I
Yeah.
loved what I saw. As
Mhm.
a fan, I loved the finish,
Mhm.
and so to me, it was like watching poetry in motion, and that's
Mhm.
what they add to a lot of times when you see fighters fight poetry in motion. That's true boxing,
Yes.
and so again, I think the probably the most famous knockout from yesteryear would be George Foreman knocking out Joe Frazier,
Yeah.
bouncing him off the canvas.
Yeah. Oh,
Uh,
I was at that one. I remember very well. The 6 knockout. I mean, that probably in today's market, that would have been stopped in the first round. Would have been a 1 round knockout. And he just came in. The movable force. And Frazier was the big favorite in that fight. But you can meet your match. There's 2 punches, but Frazier had the perfect style. Just walk right into Foreman. And Foreman was a fast starter. Frazier was a slow starter. And Frazier always felt that he fought the fight incorrectly. He would have changed his style. And they fought a rematch some years later. Frazier infamously shaved his head. I don't know what he thought to intimidate Foreman, or he was losing his hair. But he tried to box early. If you look at that fight, he drops as he's boxing the first few rounds. But Foreman, just too much power for Joe. Joe was a bit past his peak at that point. It was his last fight. Made a comeback with Jumbo Cummings, but it was insignificant draw. But he tried to box him, figured I get the first 3 rounds. He was reading all the reports that if you get into the 3rd or 4th, I can take it. But Foreman just had too much raw power. And we go to Foreman jumping years ahead, because we're going to include Foreman in this broadcast, how he regains his title, Michael Moore. There's a case he's losing, he's trying to jab, but this is just the younger fighter. One shot, bang, he's out of there. And that was another one you could have counted at 50 over him. So even at that late stage, he had that such incredible power that when he had to use it, he found it somewhere.
Of course, because George Foreman, I think, did he get gold in the Olympics or was it silver? I think he got gold in the Olympics.
68,
gold
yes.
in the 68 Olympics. And then and his style was technically, you wouldn't look at him and think, wow, this guy's a Pernell Whitaker. This guy's technically, he was big, he was raw, he could knock you out with a jab, he'd swing the shots. And Ali kind of sung his song when he was talking about the fight with Foreman. He said, this guy's like a mummy. You can see the shots coming a mile off. And I'm quite sure the fight could see the shots coming a mile off, but you just couldn't get out of the way.
Yeah.
And if they hit you, he took you off. He didn't knock you down. He knocked you out, as in out of the ring.
Yeah.
His power was that mad.
No, absolutely. I remember Foreman when he destroyed Ken Norton. You bring up Ali. I mean, he's not perceived as a puncher, but he could. Look, he did. He's the only man ever to stop George Foreman. He stopped Ron Lyle, and these are great big punchers. He stopped Frazier in the 3rd fight. Now, again,
Cleveland Williams,
and destroyed Zora Foley. In fact, a lot of people, Teddy Brennan, the matchmaker of the Garden, always thought that Foley quit or took a dive. I mean, the notorious 2nd fight with Liston. But it does show you very similar punches. Short, chopping punch. If you have it timed perfectly, you can knock guys out. And so Ali never develops he could punch, enough to win fights by knockout. He's sort of very much underrated, as they had earlier underrated his durability. Everybody figured, he's going to be frail. He was stopped once by Larry Holmes and not knocked out, not counted out in, the 2nd to last fight. So his punching ability is greatly underrated.
How would you view his knockout of Sonny Liston, the Phantom Punch?
I just touched on that. I think it was a legitimate punch. I think Liston was coming in. He hit him with this chopping shot. The problem is the chaos that followed that. And people don't recall. I think we spoke of this earlier. They were both on their feet. Doesn't say that Liston would have won. Watch the film or watch the tape, and you can see they're exchanging blows. Ali's getting the better of him. I think he knocked him down. I think Liston was confused. John gets personal. Everybody's got a theory. I think it was just maybe like a quit. I think Liston just went in, sort of like Duran did with Leonard. I mean, he got humiliated in that second fight. I don't know. Liston was just full of it or fed up. I think I think he trained very hard for the fight, and it was postponed because Ali got the hernia. Then it was thrown out of Boston. Then it was going to happen. It was happening. It wasn't happening. I think Liston just sort of let down. I just maybe psychologically going in, he didn't have it. Although had they continued to fight, and if you look at the few seconds that they did before Walcott came over and said you were counted out, Ali was landing punches. He probably would have got by that round, Liston, and might have been stopped. It would have probably had a similar ending to the first fight, where, Ali just outboxed him, and too young, too fast, too strong. Nobody knew how great this guy was. But I don't know. I just don't see the motivation why Liston takes a dive. Why would he do that? You hear the Muslims threaten, the mafia, there's millions bet. It's just a man waited that long to win the title. I don't see him doing it. I do think that Liston had already peaked by the time he fought Patterson. Look at that career. He's fighting 10 years. He wins the title, and a man like Liston, it was like Frazier after beating Ali. He was shot. He had enough left to beat lesser opponents, but he couldn't beat a Foreman. He couldn't beat an Ali again. He just didn't have. And Liston won with Patterson, completely came to England. He dissipated. He had done more than he could ever do, and it was gone. And he just happened to fight the greatest fighter of all time in 2 back-to-back bouts.
Don, that series one of the big punches, intriguing, exciting. I'm quite sure we've missed a few, but that's what makes our fight game so intriguing. Tune into series 2, and we'll come more modern day. We'll talk Mike Tyson, we'll talk Deontay Wilder, and the likes of Lennox Lewis. We'll talk of the likes of Evander Holyfield, but that's in series 2 of the big punches.
Look forward to it, John. Thank you.